the mic turned completely off, and I'm going to test. Good. Give it up, Florenzo, improv. This is how you know we're not pre-recorded. So we begin with words from the great social justice activist Angela Davis. In a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. Last week, we talked about the history and creation of the 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism. A very quick review. We, as Unitarian Universalists, like to say that we're a living tradition, a living tradition. What does that mean? It means the tradition part is we have amazing roots that go back to Jesus of Nazareth and even beyond into Judaism, and a rich history that brings us to this moment. But it is a living tradition, which means it's not static, it's not frozen in time, but it is engaged, it is energetic, it reacts to the knowledge, the changes, and the progress of the times. So it is a faith tradition that is constantly shifting and changing to serve the present moment, while never losing the key values that we've held onto through this history, this tradition. Most of the Christian churches around us have what we call a creed. A creed is a set of statements, a set of beliefs that someone else figured out, usually a long time ago, and it's been defined as true with a capital T. And in order to be part of that group, you have to say, yes, I'm going to think that way. Or as my dad would always say, you cross your fingers, put it behind your back, and say you do. But a creed is about how you think, and it's to have us all think the same way. But Unitarian Universalists believe that we need not think alike to love alike. And that is something that Francis David, who was one of our ancestors, who was locked in prison and died there because he dared to think freely. That is what Francis David said. We need not think alike to love alike. And love is at the core of Unitarian Universalism and what we call a covenantal faith. Not a creed, but we have a covenant at the core of Unitarian Universalism. A covenant is a set of promises that we make to each other in the world about how we're going to be in relationship with each other. A creed is about how you think. A covenant is about what we do. What we do. And that covenant is a promise that we make. A covenant is part of the living tradition. So that covenant, or those set of relational doings, changes over time. It grows, deepens, and changes as our living tradition of Unitarian Universalism grows, deepens, and changes to be more relevant and authentic in this moment in time. The version of our covenant, the 7 principles, was approved in 1984. It is almost unrecognizable from the original covenant of Unitarian Universalism that was created in 1961. Someday, there's going to be a brand new version of our covenant, our principles, that will probably be mostly unrecognizable from our current beloved principles, because this faith is going to continue to grow, deepen, and change. And I think that is one of the great, great strengths of Unitarian Universalism. So even though, it's good. So if you were here last week, we did share those principles, but to remind us, and if you weren't here last week, we want to just feel like you're right on board. So would you join me in saying aloud our beloved 7 principles? The 7 principles and purposes of Unitarian Universalism. We covenant, there's that word again, covenant to affirm and promote, 1, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another, and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, the goal of a world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and respect for the interdependent web of existence of which we are a part. All existence, I love it, of which we are a part. Give it up for the 7 principles. Now, these are the religious principles that make us who we are as a Unitarian Universalist people of faith. They are our Unitarian Universalist ways of being in relationship with each other and the world. This is what makes us one. But, as we've been saying, we are a living tradition, which means something created in 1984 should be able to evolve to address new relevancies that couldn't even be imagined in 1984 or were deliberately ignored in 1984. Recently, some Unitarian Universalists, especially Unitarian Universalists who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, have been asking, are these enough? Are these 7 principles enough? And the answer for some is no. 155 Unitarian Universalist congregations, in a grassroots effort, have adopted a new 8th principle to address our majority white denomination's growing understanding of just how pernicious and deadly white supremacy culture is to Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Before us, the Unitarian Universalist Church of Fresno, California, is this question. Do we want to become the 156th congregation out of 2,000 Unitarian Universalist congregations in this country to adopt the 8th principle on a local level and force the issue to be addressed at the national level? Nope. Sounds like I don't even have to do the sermon then. This change in our principles is being driven by individual congregations like ours, if we so choose. Now, it's really important for us to know and for us to own the fact that although we have many noted racial justice crusaders who were Unitarian and Universalists, overall, Unitarian and Universalist institutions have a shameful history when it comes to race. Many of our New England congregations and then others across the country were actively involved in genocide against indigenous peoples. Our congregations and our ministers, our spiritual leaders, participated in the destruction of indigenous cultures and the theft of tribal lands. Many of our East Coast congregations profited from the slave trade. Many of our ministers in the 1800s and beyond were trained at Harvard University, which was founded in 1636 as the first institution of higher learning in America and this country's first seminary to train ministers. According to APM reports, slavery and the slave economy thread through the first 150 years of Harvard's history. Slaves made beds and meals for Harvard presidents and Unitarian ministers. And many of the school's major donors in its first centuries made their fortunes in industries either based on or connected to slavery, which means that any Unitarian Universalist minister's Master of Divinity degree from Harvard drips with the blood of slaves. And any financial assistance a Unitarian Universalist seminary student receives from Harvard comes from an endowment initially funded by the slave economy. And your minister on this chancel benefited from a degree and financial support from that endowment funded initially by the slave economy. From the mid-1800s through the 1960s, Unitarian and Universalist institutions actively thwarted ministers of color, destroyed their careers. They also worked against the success of Black Unitarian congregations and schools. The question is often asked, why aren't there majority Black Unitarian Universalist congregations and schools? The truth is, they were started, and then they were destroyed by Unitarian and Universalist institutions. In the late 1960s, for most of us, our lifetime, the Unitarian Universalist Association promised to partially right those wrongs by investing several $million into a newly formed Black Unitarian Universalist organization. The next year, they withheld the money, breaking the promise, the covenant, and causing many Black Unitarian Universalists to leave the denomination in disgust, giving up completely on Unitarian Universalism. According to the leaders who initiated the Eighth Principle Project, in 1997, the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly voted to commit to intentionally becoming anti-racist, anti-oppression, multicultural institution. In the few years after this vote, there was some good progress, including programs such as Journey Towards Wholeness, what I did when I first stepped into a Unitarian Universalist congregation, the Jubilee Anti-Racism training workshops, and the inclusion of process evaluation at meetings to see who had a voice, and also hiring multicultural consulting services. But, not surprisingly, in a majority white denomination, the funding dried up when money got tight and other priorities took center stage. Until just a few years ago, 2016, when many Unitarian Universalist religious professionals of color outraged at the racially biased hiring practices at the national level and weary of racism and aggression from congregants at the local level, these religious professionals of color demanded a racial reckoning within Unitarian Universalism. The last 6 years have been a time of painful and honest truth-telling and learning as we came face to face with how white supremacy culture manifests in our own Unitarian Universalist institutions. Combine this with a growing awareness of the new Jim Crow, the school-to-prison pipeline for Black youth, anti-voting legislation that is sweeping the country and the state of policing in our communities of color, it has become clear that we Unitarian Universalists need to be more intentional about addressing racism within ourselves and within our institutions, as well as within our communities. The eighth principle is one way of being more intentional about this work. Congregations currently covenant together to affirm and promote those 7 principles, but none of them specifically address racism. The proposed 8th principle changes that and came from a feeling that we need something to renew our commitment to this work, to hold ourselves accountable, and to fulfill the potential of our existing principles. Now, one common reaction to the idea of an 8th principle is to ask, isn't racial equality already covered in our first principle? We affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Now, I love this first principle. It's a beautiful way of saying all lives matter. In theory, this is true. In practice, it is not, which is why we, as a Unitarian Universalist congregation, feel religiously compelled to display our Black Lives Matter banners and our Black Lives Matter flag. The 8th proposed principle is a way of saying the lives of people of color should matter as much as white lives, but in America, they don't. And we want to be held accountable to actively create the country, community, religion, and congregation where they do. So let me give us an example of where our Fresno church leadership has already done that, changed the way we think about how we welcome and who we welcome. Many of us know our mission statement. We're called to, and if you know it, you can say it with me, love inclusively, grow spiritually, serve gratefully, and work for justice. Amar inclusivamente, crecer espiritualmente, servir con gratitud y trabajar por la justicia. Fewer of us know the end statement of our congregation. How many people even know we have an ENDS, E-N-D-S statement in our congregation? Okay, a few of us. So, the end statement is like a vision statement. It captures how we know we will be actually fulfilling our mission, the mission that we just said. It's also how the minister, me, how I'm evaluated by the board of trustees and whether I'm doing a decent job or not. It's how the staff is evaluated in guiding the church in this direction. It's also how church leaders and the board of trustees itself guides itself in this direction. Now, our ends statement has 3 parts. The ends, E-N-D-S, of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Fresno, and I love this first one, to transform lives toward compassion. Let's just say it because it's so wonderful. To transform lives toward compassion. The second is to foster and nurture a welcoming religious community, period, at the end of that. And the third, to create peace, justice, and sustainability in our wider community and world. Those were the ends when I arrived to become your minister in August of 2015. When I arrived, many younger church members of color and some of our older white members were direct and explicit in their expectation for my ministry here. They yearned for a congregation that would de-center whiteness and lift up other voices and perspectives. They yearned for a congregation that one day could be truly multiracial and multicultural. They demanded, how can we hold our minister, staff, and church leadership accountable to decentering whiteness, accountable for laying the groundwork that would, in time, sprout the seeds of living more fully into our vision of being truly multiracial, multicultural congregation. There was this yearning, but there was nothing explicitly calling us to do this hard work. And so, the Board of Trustees changed the end statement of the church to hold us all accountable to this deep yearning. The second ends statement, to foster and nurture a welcoming religious community, was expanded. That period was erased, and it now reads, to foster and nurture a welcoming religious community that is intentionally multiracial and multicultural and challenges racist biases and behaviors. That is how your minister is evaluated. That is how your staff is evaluated. That is how our church leadership is evaluated. Are we serving our mission in such a way that we are intentionally multiracial, multicultural, and challenging racist biases and behaviors? And dear ones, that is what the eighth principle wants to do for Unitarian Universalism as a whole. It's as simple and direct as that, and we've already done it here. Now, the draft language for the eighth principle that emerged from the grassroots level is complex, and I'm going to own it is wordy, and it will most likely eventually be simplified. But at this stage in its grassroots development, there is deliberate complexity because it seeks to address all the varied ways anti-racist work in the denomination has gone awry in the past and failed. So, the draft principle reads, we covenant to affirm and promote. So there's our word covenant. Affirm just means, yep, I'm going to put my heart on it, but promote means we're going to do more than just say I like it. It means we're going to do something about it. We're going to promote it. And the first word is such a juicy, wonderful Unitarian Universalist word. The first word is journeying. Because as Unitarian Universalists, we believe that life is a spiritual journey that unfolds over time. So we start this new principle by saying it's going to be a journey. It's going to take a long time for it to happen, but transformation is at the core of who we are as Unitarian Universalists. And just to make sure we're not just aimlessly journeying, the next word is toward. We're going to journey toward something. We're not aimless. We're heading in, we would say, the right direction. And guess what it's heading toward? I love this next one, spiritual wholeness. So we are claiming up front that this work is religious work, this work is spiritual work, but by doing it, we are going to become more spiritually whole as individuals and as a people of faith. Okay. Sounds good. We're going to journey towards spiritual wholeness. How's that going to happen? By working. So here again, we're saying this is going to take work. And I love this working because it connects to our mission, work for justice, trabajar por la justicia. So it's connecting us as a congregation to this larger work. And we're going to be working. Next is to build. We're going to create something. It's something that really doesn't exist right now. We are going to work to start constructing it. And what is it that we're going to build? We are going to build a diverse. We'll stop here. because diversity in Unitarian Universalism is thought to be a good thing. In a lot of churches, diversity, anybody who's different, anything that doesn't fit the norm or the mold, get it out of the way so we can all be similar. We say our strength comes from diversity. And so we are going to build a diverse, next word, multicultural. The next word is a word that comes from the lexicon of Dr. Martin Luther King and some of our great civil rights leaders from the 60s. We are going to build a multicultural, beloved community. That is what Dr. Martin Luther King's vision was for this country, and we're saying we want to take that, and this is going to be our vision for Unitarian Universalism. It's not focused on individual wants and needs, but it puts the greater good of all and the community before the individual. And we're going to build this multicultural, beloved community. How? By our actions. Again, getting action into this thing because we have stopped doing it over and over and over throughout our history. We're going to make sure it's solid in this draft principle. And the next is so important, that accountably, we are naming up front, we are going to be judged on this, we are going to hold ourselves accountable, and there will be a way that this change will be measured. We're not going to be able to wiggle out of it this time. And we will accountably dismantle racism, but we don't stop there because we know that all oppression is intersectional, so we add and other oppressions, so sexism, ableism, ageism, imperialism, capitalism, and so much more. And we are going to dismantle this where we start in ourselves, because we all have pieces of that inside ourselves, and then by extension in our institutions, in our congregations, and in the larger denomination. So this is the draft of the eighth principle. We covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. Now, I'm going to use my psychic power. I imagine there's at least one person out here today who says, I love the spirit of that draft, but can I do some rewrites so it rolls poetically and trippingly off my tongue? Our Board of Trustees and our Mosaic Makers team asks that we resist this temptation so that all the grassroots congregations are presenting the same language to the larger denomination, so we have one similar starting point nationally. I quote our Board of Trustees and our Mosaic Makers team. Can we change the wording before we approve it? This is what they say. To put it plainly, no. We can't change the wording. We are being asked to adopt the proposed wording of the eighth principle as it stands. The wording was created by Unitarian Universalists of color and other Unitarian Universalist activists deeply engaged in anti-racist work. It also has the support of BLUE, which is Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism, the national black organization of UUs. It has already been adopted by 155 congregations. Adopting the wording as suggested by the creators shows unified support for the eighth principle and preserves the intent and spirit behind it. That is what the Board of Trustees says. That is what Mosaic Makers say. And as was the case for the 7 principles that came before it, which had extensive rewriting over a multi-year process, it is highly likely the language will change at the national level before it is approved. So, Approving this draft language as it stands really boils down to one question. Will we be known as wordsmiths or Unitarian Universalists who work for justice? There will be 3 congregational 8th principle informational meetings with question and answer and discussion. And if someone says, can we rewrite these? What's the answer? No. The first of these will be today at noon right here on Alluvial Ave and right here on our virtual campus on Zoom. The next question and answer informational session will be Tuesday, April 26th at 10 a.m., Zoom only. Then another chance the next day, April 27th on Zoom only. There is Zoom for all 3 meetings, so our virtual campus is absolutely part of this process. That Zoom meeting, it's going to be put in the chat box right now, and it's number 99227033149. Then, after the conversation, because you use half to converse and discuss, we will vote yay or nay at our congregational meeting on Sunday, May 15th at noon. Now, this is an incentive to become a member of the church at our upcoming New Member Sunday on April 10th, because being a member of the church allows us to vote and participate in this history-making moment for the Unitarian Universalist Church of Fresno. Voting on May 15th will allow us to actively be part of the living tradition of Unitarian Universalism as we grow, deepen, and change who we're going to be as a religious people of faith. As author and pastor Cassidy Hall so powerfully states, may we participate in the revolution. A revolution that doesn't need us, but will define us. A revolution that doesn't need us, but will define us. We end with the words of a powerful and proud Black woman, author, activist, and educator Rachel Cargle. She rocks. She says, anti-racism work is not self-improvement work for white people. It doesn't end when white people feel better about what they've done. It ends when Black people are staying alive and they have their liberation. Que así sea, bendito sea. May it be so. Blessed be. Amen.